Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to share with you my wrap up for the month of April. This was also Magical Readathon month, so I have read quite a lot and I'm very happy with the amount of books that I've read. But as you may know, I am trying to achieve a 0 TBR. So at the beginning of these wrap-ups, I also tell you some numbers that are important for this goal. And then afterwards we go into the individual reviews of all of the books that I have read. So let's start out with the numbers. So I started out April with 54 books on my TBR. And let's see how much we could reduce this through the month. So first of all, in April I managed to read 12 books overall, which is quite a steep number. This was definitely my best reading month so far, which, 12 is quite a lot. I usually try to read around 8 books a month, so we definitely achieved something else here. But then if I look at the number of books that I have bought, I actually bought 4 books, which is also quite a lot because, if we buy books, we don't reduce the TBR, which is unfortunately how the world works. So some of these books were audiobooks and I do not have a backlist of audiobooks, so I always buy them new, so that's fine by me. But then I also splurged on a copy of The Familiar by Ali Hazelwood, so that wasn't so great. But yeah, 4 books bought. And then for borrowed, it's even worse because I borrowed 5 books from the library in April. And Libby is definitely getting to be a bit of a problem for my TBR goals, because if I borrow so many books and read those, I do not read down my TBR. And then one more thing we have to keep in mind is that one of the books that I have read in April was a reread, so that one also did not reduce my TBR. So overall, if we take all of these numbers together, 12 books read, 4 books bought, 5 books borrowed, 1 reread, we reduced our TBR by 2 books. It's 2 books. Like, I read 12 and I only reduced my TBR by 2, which is not great. This is not how I want this to go. So at the end of April now, we are at 52 TBR books. And I'm not proud of that, I'm really not, but this is how the readathon month went. A lot of that had to do with finding books that fit the prompts, and then also I had some longer holds that came in. So what I want to say is it's not my fault, but I still failed this month. So let's just forget all about that and let's go into the book reviews. So we're starting at the beginning of the month, and the first book that I finished was my audiobook, Where Sleeping Girls Lie by Faridah Àbíké-Íyímídé. This was a book I mainly listened to in March, but I finished it right at the beginning of April. This is a bit of a difficult book to review for me because I had some issues with it, but I guess the main issue was just that my expectations were so high, because the first book by this author, Ace of Spades, was one of my favorite books of the year when I read it, and so I was so excited to finally get a new book by this author, but my expectations were like 5 stars high, and unfortunately Where Sleeping Girls Lie didn't quite live up to that. Now, in this book we are following a young girl called Sade, and she grew up in a very restrictive family and she never went to an actual school, but now her parents are dead and she is starting the school year at this very prestigious boarding school. And this has very British vibes, I guess. And then, we have this school. If we compare her 2 books, then in this one we don't have that that setting where a lot of the students are white and then only Sade is a black girl. We do actually have quite a bit more of a diverse cast in the school, which I did definitely enjoy. And when Sade gets to this school, she meets her new roommate Elizabeth, who is actually of Asian descent, and they get along quite well. Elizabeth shows her around the school for the first day, but then the next day she is missing, like Elizabeth is just gone. And so we do have this mystery of what happened to her, and Sade has a reason to want to figure that out. But the problem with this book is that both Elizabeth and Sade do have a very big secret, and that secret, if we would know it, would help us understand the character motivations so much better, to really feel for these characters a lot more. But we only learn them right at the end of the book, and at that point it's really hard to then care, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there was a lot of information about these characters that I would have needed at the beginning, and then the thrillery part maybe wouldn't have been to find out the secrets of these girls, but what are they gonna do? Like, they have this big goal, both of them, that connects them in a way, and to see this come to fruition, basically. And I think that would have made a much better book, where we really care about the characters, where we know why they do what they do, and we have this emotional connection. And then the other thing, unfortunately, is that this book is way too long, and especially the first 2/3 of the book are way too long. That should have probably been 1/3 of the story, and then we would have had the kind of balance that you would expect from a thriller. But unfortunately, the way this did things, you just have a lot of very mundane stuff that is not uninteresting to read about, but it just felt so dragged out, and the book was just too long. So even though I did have quite a few criticisms of this book, I still gave it 4 stars. I still think it is a good book. It is written well, and the overall themes are very important. It's basically a Me Too book in a way. And I think bringing these topics up for younger girls now is still very important. But as I said, I think this could have been such a great story if we would have known what our characters are really aiming for, instead of watching them kind of clueless on why they're doing it, trying to figure out this mystery that overall just felt lackluster. So yeah, that was a bit sad, but as I said, I would still recommend it. It's not a bad book, but it just did not live up to the 5-star prediction. Okay, the next book is a similar story, because we're talking about A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. This one I got as a gift for Easter, and I went straight into it. I was so excited. I loved the first book of this author, Stay With Me, and I have waited a long time for a next book. Not that they are connected in any way, but just from this author. And then unfortunately, this also did not live up to my 5-star, super high expectations. In this book, we are following mainly 2 characters. We have a young woman from a very wealthy family in Nigeria, and she is training to be a doctor. She's just started working in a hospital, and she also has a partner, a boyfriend, and this is a very big part of her story, this relationship she has. And then on the other side of things, we are watching the story, or we're seeing the story of a young boy whose family has fallen into poverty, His father was a teacher for history, and the Nigerian government decided that this is not a very important book, a very important subject for their students. So they basically let go of all the kind of humanities and arts teachers, and they try to focus the school system just on like, what are they called, like nature science and kind of like MIT technology kind of subjects. So with losing his job, his father now is depressed, and he can't help the family survive because his depression is just basically crushing him. And so we see this young boy who lives in this very like poverty, this very poor state basically. The poverty just is in every part of his life, and we are looking at these two point of views, and there is some kind of crossover, but it's very minimal. Like, we do see that these two different like types of people, these two different social classes, they do kind of meet each other, but we also see that they don't really see each other necessarily. Or at least the people at the top, they don't always like really see the people at the bottom. Like, it's very hard to explain, but I thought that was quite interesting how it was put into this novel. But then a lot of this book focused on a very abusive relationship, and that was just so hard for me to read. I was not prepared for that because I didn't know it would be that way. I didn't know that this would be the central thing that we explore in here. There is also other things, and those are mentioned in the description of the book, where it's more about politicians and how this this society is just very volatile and fragile, and the democracy doesn't really work well. So this is definitely in here as well, but it's so much about this abusive relationship, and I just was not prepared. So in the end I gave this one 4 stars as well. I do think it is a good book and an interesting story to tell. The ending is quite open though, and I was just hoping after this very, very bleak story that at the end there would just be a little bit of hope, a little bit of a light, and that didn't really happen for me. So that's why, yeah, this was just a very depressing read overall. The next book I read is by a German author, and that is Die Unerzählte Geschichte by Vera Weidenbach. This is a non-fiction book focusing in on stories of women that made very, very important contributions to the way we live today, and they have been mostly forgotten. So this book is trying to tell their stories. It does that by going through different times in history and then focusing in on these different women, what they were doing at the time, and trying to recreate those stories and show their achievements. And I did really enjoy this one. I think that the way that it portrayed these stories, like the writing style, it was super easy to read, and I just could fly through it, which was really nice. And the cat is just being so mischievous again, and I don't know if I should let her. The criticisms that I had with this book is that still the stories told in here were very white, which it focuses on Germany, so that is kind of to be expected, but it does look into other countries as well, and I think that it could definitely have included more women of color. And then also, for example, the topic of like trans women is not discussed in here at all, even though I'm pretty sure that there were trans women who did very important work. And we just let them be invisible, as the book is trying to not to do. So yeah, I thought that the way the women were chosen could have been a bit more inclusive, and so overall I gave it 4 stars. Then the next book I finished was another audiobook, and that was Sitting Pretty by Rebekah Taussig. This is also a non-fiction book. It is a memoir by the author, and it focuses in on her life as a disabled woman, and she's using a wheelchair. And so she talks about how that influences her life, and she also studied disability studies, so she puts a lot of scientific knowledge into this book as well. And I gave this book 5 stars because I thought the way that she interwove her story and then the more scientific facts together to create a full picture was just amazing. I really enjoyed that. I had so much fun reading this book. I also got so angry at times reading this book just because people need to wake up and people need to understand how having a disability influences her life or people's lives and how it doesn't. And there were just some mentions of ableist views in here that just got me so mad. But overall it was just a fantastic book and one that I would wish everyone reads. So if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend. And then I also finished The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. Now this is also a little bit of a difficult book to talk about. This is kind of a historical fiction with some horror elements that leans into kind of gothic fiction, I would say. And in this one we follow a young woman in the 19th century. She is pregnant and she's on the way to her husband's kind of estate, manor house, whatever, and her husband has just passed away. So basically he went to that manor house first. He wanted to prepare it so everything is ready when she arrives, but during that time he died, and it's very mysterious. And her brother is like, hey, you have to get out of the city because people are talking, you just married this man and now he's dead, and you just have to go to the country, let people forget this ever happened. And so he pushes her to go to this house even though she doesn't really want to. And when she arrives, just weird things start to happen. Now, I would recommend, if you're interested, to look up Dutch silent companions, because this is a thing that actually existed and is quite creepy. So I think using that for the horror elements in this book worked quite well. It also reminded me a little bit of How to Sell a Haunted House, just in the way that some of the it's probably not comparable, but it reminded me of it. And the tone is very different, the plot is very different, but it just had some themes that are quite similar. Now, the big problem I had with this book is that there is a lot of anti-Romani sentiment in this book. There is a lot of the cheese slur in this book, and it did not serve a purpose. Now, you can say that this was historically accurate. This is how people thought about that. But if you write that in a modern book, it has to serve a purpose. You have to somehow show how that was wrong. And in a way, this book kind of does it, but not in an explicit way, how I wanted it to go for it to make sense to me to make this such a big part of the story. So it just fell really flat for me. The story itself was pretty good, but just that I couldn't. So I gave it 3.5 stars, but I wouldn't recommend this book necessarily. Then the next book I finished was a novella, and that is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. This was quite an interesting book as well. In this one, we are following a young Senegalese man during the First World War, and he's fighting for the Allied forces, basically, in France, I think. And he has to watch his best friend die. And the book starts out with that scene. So basically, the best friend has just passed away. And our main character is starting to regret that he didn't kill him to end his suffering earlier, because his best friend, he was wounded very, very badly, and then it took a very long time for him to actually pass away, so he was begging his friend to just end it, but he didn't do it, and we see the like downward spiral that this regret invokes in our main character. So this is definitely a book about the horrors of war. It was very, very interesting to learn about this, these Senegalese people, because I had no idea that they fought in the First World War. So that was definitely something new I learned from this book as well. But I did have some like pacing issues with it, because similar to what I talked about earlier, in this book we do get a lot of like the background story of these two friends at the end of the book, and I think knowing that earlier would have helped to understand our character better. But then it also kind of makes sense why he only thinks about that at the end of the book, because we're very much in his head. And this book is written very lyrically, so I think a lot of people will not like this writing style. It has a lot of repetition, but this repetition to me was very powerful, very effective. It definitely made me feel the things that I think I was supposed to feel towards this character. So I would say give it a try. It's only a novella, and maybe you'll like it. I definitely did. In the end, I gave it 3.5 stars as well. Then the next book I finished was The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, but I'm not going to talk about this book very much here, because I have a whole reading vlog where I talk about this book for a very, very long time, spoiler free, and then with a few spoilers right at the end that are clearly marked, so you can go and check that video out if you want to hear my full thoughts. I decided to give this book 3.5 stars as well. It really wasn't for me, to be honest. This is famous for being kind of a gender bending book, because we have a human person who goes to this different planet where people do not have a gender, and there is like this one time during the month where they get like sexually active, called the Cameron. And during that time they do have a sex, but it is not always the same. So this is basically a genderless, sexless planet. And that part was interesting, even though I felt like it didn't really age that well, and the way people talked about this, I expected it to age much, much better. One thing that I didn't love about this is that the main character refers to every other character in this book as he, because he's a he, and so he sees everyone as a he, and that just felt very backwards to me, because yeah, that's kind of like, you know, men being the default is just like how the world works. And I'm always a little bit like annoyed when people are supposed to be set in the far future and they still struggle with this gender thing so much, and that's just something that it's just a pet peeve of mine that I just don't like. So for example, Brave New World, same problem I had with that. Like, you imagine a great future, even if it's dystopian or if it's like sci-fi with other planets, and people are still as dumb as they were when you wrote this book. I don't know about that. So that didn't really work for me so well, but what really didn't work for me was the plot. Like, the beginning was interesting, and then we have a long way where our main character and one other character travel over glacier. And nothing happens. It becomes a survival story about a glacier. And I'm like, I'm not going to sci-fi books for that. I hate that. I really, yeah. So 3.5 stars. It was definitely something that changed literature when it came out, but it was not something that changed me in any way. Then I finished another audiobook, and that was The Vicious Games by Joelle Wellington. This is a YA thriller where we're looking at a girl who she went to this very fancy school, but she was on a scholarship because her parents worked at the school. She had the chance to go to Yale, but because of something that happens in her last school year, that chance is turned away. So she's very bitter, she still wants to go there, but there isn't really a probability that will still happen until she gets invited to this weird trial where there is a very, very rich family in her town, and they have this every year where they invite girls that compete in this trial, and the winner will basically get whatever she wants because this family is so powerful. And so now our main character thinks that this is her way to get Yale back. This book is great. It's basically if you mix The Bachelor with The Hunger Games, but at the end we kill the patriarchy, the racist capitalist patriarchy. That's my pitch for this book. So if this sounds like something you will like, definitely go and read this book. I had so much fun with it. It gets so tense. You really feel for this character. It gets very bloody as well. So this was great fun, and I was cheering our main character on every step of the way. I just loved her. Let's say that. And I gave this book 4.5 stars. I would highly recommend. Then I finished a book that is not very typical for me, but people had me intrigued, and that is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. Now, for some reason, it's very hard for me to say that. My mouth cannot form the words, but we managed it. So in this one we follow a young girl called Misery. She is a vampire, but she has spent her whole life living with humans because she was kind of this bargaining chip where she grew up with humans and a human child grew up with the vampires, so they would keep their peace. But now she is supposed to marry the werewolf alpha to kind of get this new alliance. This is a romance story. It's kind of like a paranormal, kind of fantasy romance. I never know which is which, I'm sorry. But I had a lot of fun with this one. I think this also dips its toes into the whole Omegaverse thing, which I know nothing about. So I don't have any feelings about that, I'm sorry. But this was just a very fun read, and what many people said is that besides the romance, you still have quite an interesting fantasy plotline, and I definitely agree with that. I just really liked it, and you can't really think it through too much. I think maybe then it will fall apart a little bit, but overall I had a fun time with it and I gave it 4 stars. Then we have my reread, and we're just gonna keep it nice and short. This was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This is just a children's book that is very wild. I think everyone has heard about Alice in Wonderland, and I reread this because I want to read the sequel through the Looking Glass, but it has been so long since I read the first book, so I definitely wanted to do this reread. And it just was really fun. It really reminded me how much nostalgia I have for this story, so it was a success, and I gave it 4 stars on reread. Then I read a book that I got as a gift. This is not usually what I'm very interested in, but I do always try to read every book that enters my house. So we have Peril at End House by Agatha Christie. This is a German copy, and in this book this is a Poirot novel, but I would guess it is later on in the series. I haven't looked it up, but he's already like older. He is described as kind of trying to settle down and not do the murder thing anymore, and he is trying to have a little bit of a holiday with his like friend Hastings, and they meet this young woman, and someone seems to be trying to kill her, and so that lures them into the case, and they try to make it happen that this young woman doesn't die. And this was an interesting read. It does have a lot of like casual racism, which is not great. The views that are mentioned in here are very misogynistic. I never know how to say that in English, but yeah, basically women can't do anything. There is a lot of like references that are like, oh, this is not planned out well, so it must have been done by a woman, and like these kind of sentiments. So yeah, it's just not my favorite. 30s literature is just not for me. I gave it 3 stars. The case was fun. I did guess some of the parts of the solution, but not all of them. But yeah, it's just not my thing. And then the last book I read was Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng, and we ended the month with an absolute banger. I gave this book 5 stars. It is so fantastic, probably my favorite Celeste Ng book so far, and I have given all of her books 5 stars. So definitely favorite author for sure. In this one we do have a dystopian story, which I was quite surprised by because the previous 2 books by the author were contemporary. We are looking at a world that I would say is about like 15 years away from where we are right now. And you can definitely see the influences of the pandemic time. This book was published in 2022, so it was definitely written during the pandemic. And while the pandemic doesn't really pop up in the book, you still see that a lot of what was caused or what was going on at the time definitely inspired the story. We are basically looking at a world that has a new Cold War, but this time with China. And so the US has turned against like Asian people in general, and it has established something called PACT, where you can tell authorities if you see someone who doesn't act patriotic. And yeah, it's very frightening, very scary, but the main thing that we focus on in this dystopian story is that PACT enables the state to take children away from their families, and how that is portrayed as keeping these children safe from their unpatriotic families, but in reality is used to blackmail these families, to either discourage them from protest at all, or to punish them and then basically give them the hope that if they are patriotic, they will get their child back eventually. And this is just very, very heartbreaking to read. It's a very sad story. We see this story through the eyes of a young boy called Bird. His mother is of Asian descent and his father is white. And when we start the story, his mother has disappeared and he now lives with his father. We can see how the father is trying so hard to protect his son and to make sure that nothing bad happens to him, but how difficult that is in an environment like that. So definitely recommend. I absolutely love this book so much, and I hope more people pick it up because I think this book is so under the radar and so underrated. So please, 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 if you take 2 books away from this video, it should be Sitting Pretty and Our Missing Hearts. If you want to take a 3rd book, then they're Vicious Games for sure. So I hope this was interesting to watch. I hope it wasn't too long. I know I talked a lot about some of these books, but sometimes I just have so much to say. I'm sorry. Yeah, I hope this was fun. Leave a like or a nice comment. I always really appreciate those. Let me know which was your favorite book of April, and I will talk to you very soon. Bye!